Story 1. It felt like a miracle when Mr. Marner's wife returned to him through Regan Services. I remember that day clearly, despite it being 6 years ago. My son and I were playing basketball near our old worn-out hoop. The van that passed us was so discreet we almost missed it. The windows were nearly black, which seemed unusual in hindsight. It wasn't until the van parked behind Mr. Marner's house that I noticed it, along with a few other neighbours out on that windy Friday afternoon. Since his wife's death a month earlier, the only visitors Mr. Marner had were his daughter and some church members. A new visitor was unusual. Our neighbourhood wasn't the kind of place where a fancy Region van would stop. It was like seeing a Ferrari outside a rundown house. The sight of that van was so out of place that it caught everyone's attention. My son, Bry, asked, "That's the Brain people, right?" He held the basketball, leaning against me, still young and clingy at 10 years old. "The ones from TV?" "Yeah, that's them," I replied, trying to see what was happening from our little hilltop apartment parking lot. Bry frowned and fell silent, which I knew meant he was curious about the van. He was about to throw the basketball, but I caught it and grinned at him. We played a bit, but he quickly ran to the edge of the lot to watch what was happening at Mr. Marner's house. "They're opening the van!" he shouted as I joined him. "It's full of lights and computers." Aggie Manilu in art class said they brought back her dad a while ago, and they celebrated after winter break. When Mrs. Marner stepped out of the van, looking regal, I understood why they celebrated. I was one of the people who helped Mr. Marner when he found her. That cold morning, he stumbled out of his house, clutching his chest. His neighbour asked if it was his heart, but he pointed shakily towards their dark house. Sally Marner, in her late 80s, had fallen in the garden a week earlier. She lay there until her husband came back from a dialysis appointment. She was put in end-of-life care at home the next day and passed away soon after. Mr. Marner was devastated, even though her death was expected. I felt a pang of jealousy at their strong love. It seemed impossible to be so heartbroken by death, so when a similar Region van appeared in front of my house the day my husband came home from the hospital in palliative care, I was stunned. I was at the door before the two men from the van could knock. They looked out of place in their suits, which were finely pressed but didn't fit well. "Can I help you?" I asked, feeling uncertain. "If this is a sales call, I can't afford your services." "Mrs. Derringer," the taller man said with a bright smile, "we've come a long way to meet you. May we come in?" I thought about my son, who would be home soon, and my husband, who was on oxygen in the living room. My Midwestern hospitality fought with my instinct to send them away. I had just bought this house a few months earlier, and it felt good to own our land, even if it was still a work in progress. As they entered my home, I couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The men explained that their company, Region Services, offered a unique opportunity to extend the lives of those we love. They spoke with such confidence and assurance that it was hard not to be swayed by their words. They mentioned that they had brought back several people who were in end-of-life care, giving families more time with their loved ones. Their technology was advanced, and they assured me that the process was safe and painless. They offered this service to my husband, who had been fighting a losing battle with his illness. The thought of having more time with him was both tempting and terrifying. My heart raced as I listened. Could this really be true? Could they actually bring him back from the brink? The idea seemed too good to be true, yet here they were, standing in my living room, offering this miracle. As they spoke, I felt a glimmer of hope amidst the despair that had settled over our home since my husband's diagnosis. I looked at my husband, lying frail and weak on the couch. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was labored. The thought of losing him was unbearable. I turned back to the men and asked, "How much will this cost?" Their response was reassuring. "We understand that not everyone can afford our services up front, Mrs. Derringer. We offer flexible payment plans and financial assistance for families in need. We believe that everyone deserves the chance to hold on to their loved ones a little longer." As I listened, I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the answer we had been praying for. I looked at my husband again, and a tear slipped down my cheek. The thought of having more time with him, of giving Bry more time with his father, was more than I could have ever hoped for. After a moment of silence, I nodded. "All right, let's do this." The men smiled and began setting up their equipment. As I watched, I felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was a leap of faith, but one I was willing to take for the sake of my family. I don't know why I let them in. I wished I hadn't as soon as they walked through our front door. The air felt cold, despite the roaring fireplace behind us. My husband was sleeping soundly on the living room sofa. The hospice nurse said keeping him upstairs in our bedroom would be too hard for all of us. The oxygen machine he was attached to made rhythmic huffs in time with his slowed breathing, clicking like the second hand on a clock. Every breath he took on that sofa, I feared it would be his last. And I wondered if I would stop breathing with him. "I'm Holt," said the taller boy with blonde hair past his ears, holding out his hand, which I didn't take. He curled his fingers in and smiled as though pretending not to choke on bitter food. "And my partner here is Vince." "Partner as in?" "God, no," Holt laughed, trying to ease the tension. "He's not my type." "We're sorry for your loss," Vince said, his tone suddenly sad, which stung me in a strange way. "He hasn't passed yet," I said. "Apologies. It's just that, having done this for so long, it's impossible not to see the writing on the wall. If you don't accept our offer, it may be the only time we can offer our condolences for the hardship you face. If this is your sales tactic, I suggest another field of work," I said bitterly, sitting in the armchair across from the love seat where the two salesmen sat. "Do you bully potential widows and widowers into buying your expensive services by making us fear the outcome we already expect? That won't work on me." "You mean reverse psychology?" Vince tried to correct me. "No," I smiled a fierce, protective smile. "I mean perverse. We offer hope, Mrs. Derringer." Holt stretched out his hand to me. His skin was dry and rough, like a farmhand's, reminding me of my father's farm. He sold it a few years after I married Christopher, and I regretted not taking Bry there when we had the chance. Holt's long hair made me think he was a surfer, but he seemed more like someone from the country, like me. "Don't mind him. He's still training. We're all new at some point," Vince sighed wistfully. "He's also prone to saying vague yet somehow comforting statements. Always quirks with newbies. Regardless of him, Mrs. Derringer, we have a proposition for you. Have you heard of Regan Services?" Holt's accent seemed to get more southern. "An old neighbor of mine used your service a few years ago. Other than the results, I don't know much. The ads on TV made it look like a memory regeneration service. When the van arrived at his house, I thought he would be taken away for testing, not that his late wife would walk out as if she hadn't died." "I see. Let's start with our company name." He handed me a brochure printed on fine cardstock, which felt luxurious. I didn't know paper could feel so expensive. "Regan is short for regeneration, as you guessed. We only offer our services to those in dire straits." "Dear," I repeated. "Mrs. Derringer, what's the likelihood of your husband recovering from his accident?" Vince asked. "I don't see how any of this is your business, and how do you know so much about our situation? Did the hospital share our private medical information with your company? That's a violation of our rights," I said. "Mrs. Derringer," Holt spoke again, "I assure you, all that's above our pay grade. We're given information by our supervisor to make a sales pitch. Wouldn't it be better if no one had to die from a mistake or accident? Think of us like life insurance, but instead of financial support, we ensure you don't lose your loved ones before their time." "Get out of my house," I said, disgusted. "Please." But I kept the brochure in my hand. When they left, and their black van was almost out of sight, I opened the brochure and turned toward my husband. His eyes were open and sunken, as he couldn't fully open and close them since the accident. He needed his eye drops, but I looked at the brochure first. I should have let them finish their pitch. A lot of the information was complicated. "They think they can save you, Chris," I murmured as I used the drops on his eyes, gummed up with drying fluid. His pupils fluttered, and I wondered if it was recognition or fear. I wonder if I should let them try. Then Bry, now 15, found the pamphlet, and I no longer had a choice. I'd have to let Regan Services try to save my husband. X. Free, I repeated myself for likely the dozenth time. My breath fogged up the glass of the observation room, where I watched the Regan scientists and doctors put my husband into a medical coma. This part didn't worry me. He'd been put under and in comas, both natural and induced, several times since the incident almost a year ago. The rest of the process was nerve-wracking. I still couldn't believe this was real, much less free. "Remind me of the success rate." The nurse monitoring the vitals outside the room smiled, knowing I'd ask the same question every 10 minutes. 80%, Mrs. Derringer. The 20% that didn't make it were much older and had more health risks. I have full faith he'll pull through. I tried to let that comfort me, but if I was honest, nothing about this comforted me, even the idea of my husband getting a new lease on life. I was too nervous, teeth chattering from panic, but I'd be a fool not to take this chance. Bry would never forgive me if we didn't at least try. All these months of blood and tissue samples, physical exams, and the waiting, it's terrifying. I couldn't help but admit. I think it's supposed to be scary, but it makes the recovery that much sweeter. The nurse smiled. It will be like your husband is as good as new. And it will keep looking just like him, I asked, biting my nails. The regenerated version of him. I can't help but hate the idea. A brain transplant into the cloned body of the person they're transplanted from. It's like all the humanity in me is twisted up over it. Do you believe in God, Mrs. Derringer? No, not really. Sort of, I suppose. I rubbed my head, struggling to absorb the reality of where I was and what I was doing to the man I'd married over 20 years ago. I mean, there's got to be a reason why we're all here, as a species, right? Maybe I do believe a little more than I thought. Maybe that's why this feels sort of wrong. I wasn't asking about it for you to go worrying like that. I'm sorry. I was going to ask, you want me to pray with you? The nurse asked me with a tone so kind it brought tears to my eyes, and wordlessly I nodded. Then I'll pray with you. Come here. When they finally brought my husband back, there was a strange feeling of relief, like I'd been holding my lungs still from fear of breathing. It felt as though if I'd moved wrong, everything would come crashing down. Bry was in the waiting room with both sets of his grandparents, some aunts and uncles, my sister and her kids. He stood up and ran to me, excited but scared all at once. At 15, this was one hug I was going to treasure, as I rarely got them these days. I ruffled his hair and nodded at our family. It had begun. Waiting was agony, as it usually was. Hours rolled by as Bry slowly spent my sparse stash of dollar bills and quarters for snacks and drinks. Normally we limited those things at home, but right now I had more important things to worry about than a few cans of Mountain Dew. I don't understand why it couldn't be done in a regular hospital, I heard Mama complaining to Daddy. He didn't care much for hospitals anyway, but some fancy medical facility was even less his style. I couldn't really disagree. The waiting room we sat in was more like one for a spa than for a facility where they were doing brain surgery on my husband and putting it into a copy of his own body. Though frankly I didn't know what a waiting room for something like that should look like anyway. This place gives me the creeps. They need to do it wherever they can, Greta, Chris's mother snapped. Please, keep your complaints to yourself. It's not your child's life on the line here. I'm still confused how it got to this point, Chris's father chimed in. Chris was healthy as a horse. All of a sudden he has a stroke that knocks him out a window, and then he's paralyzed from the neck down, still having seizures and strokes. He choked up. It isn't right. Me and you, he looked to his wife. We're supposed to go first. Whether it ain't right or ain't fair, it's still your boy, Daddy said. Be strong for him. Mark, Louise, Daddy's right, I insisted, desperately wanting the subject dropped, as if I hadn't been worried enough about my husband's health and recovery already. We have to keep faith. Rich, coming from you, Louise scoffed, but no one said anything more on the matter. Mama, Bryce sat beside me and leaned his head on my shoulder. No matter what happened, whether my husband lived or not, this moment in between the beginning and the fallout was more precious than gold. This man is not my husband. It started small. The doctors assured me that his memory would be fuzzy, jumbled even, but would write itself out over the course of months. It had been over 3 months, and each time after his monthly 3-day stays at their facility, to observe him and make sure his new body wasn't under any sort of stress or rejection of the procedure, his memory got stronger than the last time he went and was brought back. Our son was thrilled. No son wants to lose their father. I was hesitant, waiting for the other shoe to drop, or maybe even for Chris himself to drop. It was unnerving how right he seemed. He'd needed almost no recovery time after the procedure, and his scarring, though there, was minimal. I had expected many things, even miracles, but not a total rewriting of what I thought I knew about science and reality as a whole. They're giving him another sedative now, the nurse explained as I watched one of the doctors in blue medical coveralls take a syringe from a nurse in white. This one is a local anesthetic for the tube they'll insert at the base of his skull, and well, some of what they're doing is stuff I'm not trained on. I'm here for vitals and prep support. They'll put him in the special region isolation chamber so he won't be exposed to any more germs or bacteria, and from there he'll be wheeled off to the other room where they'll do the procedure. We can't watch that part. They say we wouldn't want to see it anyway. Bry wouldn't have noticed, but I did. He chose the wrong cereal. That was the first sign something was off. I had left our bedroom early on a Saturday morning and found him eating the same sugary cereal as our son while they watched a local hockey game on TV. Normally, you'd think a father trying to bond with his son was a nice thing, but Chris was very particular about his foods. He didn't like sweets, and he didn't like hockey. He was all about football, and had even gotten angry with Bri for wanting to play hockey instead of football. Chris was reading a lot more and much faster than before. At first, I thought it was because he had time to recover and wasn't working yet. His construction job had given him a position at a new site that wouldn't start for 2 months because it was winter. Before, he only read magazines or a few favourite books like Old Yeller, Where the Red Fern Grows, and the Harry Potter series he read to Bri years ago. Now, he was reading everything he could get his hands on: history books about ancient Rome, cheesy romance novels, cookbooks, even astrology books. It was a mix of all kinds of information. I kept telling myself it wasn't strange, just that he had changed. Sometimes I'd catch him peeking into Bri's room at night, watching him sleep like he did when Bri was little. He would pet our dog for up to an hour, not doing anything else, just sitting and staring with a blank smile. When I talked to our region caseworker, they said it was normal, just him getting used to his new body, a body without pain that might live a long time because it was new. In a way, that made sense to me. The big thing for me was that he no longer hit me. I didn't tell the Regan Services staff that. The bruises that used to cover my skin from shoulder to knee were almost gone, leaving just scars and some discoloration from burst blood vessels. I could explain those away as varicose veins at my age. When Bri was younger, it was harder to hide the marks. I wore rash guard swim shirts and trunks to the public pool and made sure to change in private once Bri got old enough to notice the marks on my body. One day, Chris caught me looking at myself in the mirror. Our eyes met in the reflection, and my mouth hung open in shock. Instead of getting angry or leaving in disgust, he came over and hugged me from behind. He held me gently while I stood there without a shirt. It was such a rare and confusing moment that it almost hurt more than any blow he'd ever given me. Then he left, and I wondered if it had really happened. X. The final clue was when I woke up very early, around 4 a.m., and saw that my husband wasn't in bed. Since his recovery, he'd often get up at night, saying he'd walk around the neighborhood or read some more, full of energy. I wasn't sure if I caught him on a rough night or if this was what he did every time he left the bed, but neither answer made me feel better. I saw a light coming from the living room below. I thought he might have fallen asleep on the sofa again, so I decided to bring him a blanket. But the light was coming from the hall bathroom, which we hardly used except for guests. The door was open a bit, and I could hear a voice. He was muttering in a slow, monotonous way I'd never heard before. It sounded foreign, drawn out, repetitive, with a strange, forced tone in the middle of the almost hypnotized words. I crept closer, afraid the floorboards would give me away. Was he sleepwalking? I moved closer, hiding in the shadows, and watched as my husband stared at himself with a blank expression, hardly moving any facial muscles except to speak. "I am," he repeated. "Christopher Derringer. I am 46 years old. Your favorite color? My favorite color is green. I was born in July, the 7th month. My wife is Audrey. We have one child, one son, a boy. I am a boy. No, a man. I am a man. I work in construction. I am afraid of heights. I have a scar on my left elbow from surgery. It means I can't play football. I love football." I was shaking. The voice was my husband's, yet totally different. It felt like it was drilling into my ears, like the ringing of a bell when you're right under it. The blanket fell from my arms. I wanted to run away, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. At best, I'd caught a man trying to recover his memories after a traumatic surgery, and at worst, this man wasn't my husband at all. I had lived with Christopher Derringer for 22 years and knew him better than anyone. What made him angry? What made him happy? What made him tick? None of those things were part of him anymore, and now I understood why. Our eyes met in the mirror's reflection, mine visible through the crack of the bathroom door. I expected shock, anger, maybe sadness, but not a smile, not a warm, loving smile. He turned to face me and opened the door to pull me into a hug. Our chests pressed together, and I could feel our hearts beating at very different speeds. His heartbeat was steady and perfect, while mine was racing like I was being squeezed by a python. Christopher hadn't hugged me with any real feeling in over 10 years, not since he started drinking heavily and lost his job, which was when he first hit me. He held my hand in his. His new skin was smooth, without the rough calluses from years of hard work. I thought about how that would make his job harder when he went back to work in a few weeks. "I know what he did to you," Christopher said, in a voice that was both his and someone else's. "I've seen the memories of you through his mind. They're all so new that I have to learn them like a schoolboy watching a lesson on a video. Do you remember those?" "Christopher." I didn't know what to say. I hoped that saying his name would snap him out of this strange state and bring us back to the life we had been living since our son was 5 years old. "I know what you did to him too," he continued, and my blood felt like ice rushing through my veins. "He saw you that last time. You had been putting antifreeze in his bourbon, but he didn't know for how long. It suddenly made sense why he was so sick. He had just finished a drink when he caught you adding more to the bottle. You fought, struggled, and it was either you or him. One of you was going through the window, and he was too drunk and you were too tired." "Christopher, I understand. I see it through his memories. As much as I'm him, I'm also someone new. I swear to whoever or whatever you believe in, that I will never, ever hurt you the way he did. Maybe it's because this body is new and sober, or maybe it's payback for what he did to you, and the universe is setting it right. Either way, I'm here, and I will make our lives so much better. Don't you see? You'll never have to flinch when I'm near you again, or sleep afraid that I'll come in drunk looking for a fight. I'm exactly what you need. Audrey, please, let me love you." We kissed with tears in our eyes. I'm not sure whose tears I tasted, but the salt reminded me of the taste of blood when he used to hit me. I wanted to believe him, to trust that the nightmare of waiting to die at his hands, or to be caught for his death, was over. It had to be over, because this man was not my husband, and I didn't mind at all. Story 2. Being alone in the woods at night never seemed scary to me. Sure, there are animals like wolves and bears that might pose a threat, but they rarely hunt humans. However, in the shadows of the trees at night, things can look very different. What appears to be an animal can seem like something much more sinister when hidden behind the dark recesses of the forest. The noises you hear at night can feel like something is playing with your sanity as you try to make sense of the wild sounds around you. Most people who camp alone aren't driven crazy by a soft rustling in the bushes. I thought I was brave and didn't mind being alone among the trees. I decided to spend a cold winter at my grandfather's cabin, but my pleasant experience quickly turned sour when the last light of day disappeared, leaving me in complete darkness. The animal moving in the shadows made me decide never to enter the woods again. It was a cold winter morning in late November 1995. I was on a solo winter trip to my grandfather's cabin to relax and enjoy the beautiful views of the mountains and hills. It had been 10 years since I last stayed in this cabin. I was 15 during my last visit and had already seen most of the beautiful scenery around. This time, I came in mid-November to see the forest in a new light. The ground was covered with a clear white blanket of snow, and ice gracefully frosted over the pine needles on the trees. The lake was completely frozen, with a thick layer of clear ice holding the tree roots on its shore. The most captivating sight was Mount Rainier, standing majestically against the sky in the distance, with a fresh cap of snow and the sunset casting orange and yellow hues on the mountain's west face. It was truly a sight to behold, and one I would never tire of. I planned to stay through December and leave in January. That should be enough time to enjoy some alone time, something I rarely get at home. It's just work 5 days a week, and weekends are spent catching up on bills and other tasks. I don't have a wife, but if I did, she'd probably be another demand on my limited free time. I kept thinking this trip would be good for me. My grandfather left me the cabin in his will because we both loved it so much. He knew I'd take good care of it. After a few hours of driving and turning onto a gravel driveway off United States Forest Service Road 59, I finally arrived at the cabin. It was smaller than I remembered, but it had been 10 years since I'd last seen it. The cabin seemed to have shrunk over time, as if my memories had exaggerated its size. The first thing I did after arriving was set my luggage down and walk back out. The day was still early, and I had plenty of time to walk to the lake and do some ice fishing. After spending most of the day at the lake, I started to head back to the cabin. I had caught 2 trout and decided to have them for dinner. The cabin was already stocked with enough food to last months, but I wanted my first meal to be special and freshly prepared. I cleaned the fish, seasoned them with some herbs and spices I found in the cabin, and cooked them over an open flame in the fireplace. The crackling fire and the smell of the cooking fish filled the cabin, creating a cozy and warm atmosphere. Earlier, I had noticed some animal tracks near the lake. They looked like bear tracks, but I wasn't sure. Usually bears start hibernating by late November. At that time, I didn't think much of it and went back to the cabin. After dinner, I threw the scraps in the outside trash can and started planning for the next day. Another hour later, as the sun was setting, it started to snow again. The snowfall was thicker, and soon the ground was covered with white flakes. Winter had officially arrived. The snowflakes danced in the air, gently covering everything in a pristine white blanket. The world outside the cabin transformed into a winter wonderland, silent and serene. The cabin was too far from civilization to have power from a plant. Instead, the lights were powered by a small portable diesel generator that could illuminate 3 light bulbs, a heater, a refrigerator, and a record player that had been there since the cabin was built in 1957. I fell asleep that night listening to my grandfather's big band jazz collection, especially Glenn Miller's Moonlight Sonata, which was the perfect end to a perfect day. The music filled the room, its soothing notes lulling me into a deep and peaceful sleep. Little did I know that this peaceful evening would soon give way to a night filled with terror and uncertainty. Early the next morning, I woke up around 4 a.m. I had plenty of time to make my way towards the lake and up the hill to watch the sunrise. Before leaving, I noticed something had rummaged through my trash can. The tracks in the snow were definitely bear tracks. These prints were huge, about 20 inches long. I didn't think bears around here grew that big. After cleaning up the mess, I went inside to grab my bear spray, just to be safe. If a bear that big feels comfortable walking around an occupied cabin, who knows what it could do if I ran into it in its territory. I started up the hill, and the sunlight began to wash over the distant mountain. Satisfied with the view, I headed back down in a new direction. Not long into the hike, I came across an old, rotted tree, slightly leaning toward the right, standing on the edge of a small 5-foot cliff. The roots of this tree were overgrown. The ones hanging off the cliff face had broken off, revealing a large hole underneath the old dead tree. It looked like the entrance to a cave. Curious, I peered down into the hole. Daylight illuminated a few feet, lighting up a small portion of the entrance. There, a little ways in, tucked behind a rock, was the skull of a male deer, still with its antlers. The only thought I had at the time was, that would look great hanging on my cabin door. I stepped past the rock and pulled out the flashlight from my pack to get a closer look. The light illuminated the ground, revealing not just the deer skull, but the whole skeleton. The bones were pure white, picked clean, with signs something had been chewing on them. Then it hit me. I realized I was standing in the den of a hibernating bear. Not wanting to leave empty-handed, I quickly grabbed the skull and turned towards the exit. One of the bones rattled loose and struck against the rock, sending a soft sound slowly increasing in volume as it echoed further into the cave's darker parts. Silence returned, at least for a moment. I again turned towards the exit, and as I stepped out into daylight, a low, deep growl echoed from the darkness behind me. I started sprinting down the hill and past the lake, clutching the deer skull tightly, eventually making my way back to the cabin. That was probably the fastest I had ever run in my life. Nothing like the fear of death to get you moving. Later that day, I hung the skull on the outside of my cabin door. It looked great, just as I thought. I figured the bear would be afraid to come around if it knew someone was here. As the sun set, I turned on the porch light, lighting up the driveway to the edge of the tree line. Surely any animal, including a bear, would be intimidated by that sight. A few hours after I fell asleep, I was woken by the sound of a creaking floorboard on the front porch. I jumped out of bed and peeked through the blinds. With a full view of the porch, I saw nothing but falling snow, lit by the golden yellow glow of the porch light. Sensing no immediate threat, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch to investigate the noise. Looking at the ground, I spotted clear tracks coming and going from the front door, trailing off into the forest. Damn, this bear was bolder than I thought, and the tracks suggested it was walking on its hind legs. I turned to head back inside and stopped. The skull, it was gone. I turned back and gazed into the darkness where the tracks vanished into the trees. There, low to the ground, were a pair of eyes staring back at me. The bear stood too far to be visible under the porch light, but close enough for the light to make its eyes appear to glow with anger. I quickly pushed the door open and jumped back inside, locking it after it slammed shut. I spent the rest of the night sitting under the window, periodically peeking out at the bear, its eyes locked onto me for hours. I had dozed off after getting tired of looking out the window. Suddenly, I was awoken again by the sound of crushing metal coming from the side of the cabin. Too afraid to confront a bear of such massive size, I just sat there waiting for the sun to rise. After the sun had been up for a few hours, I felt safe enough to step outside. I was sure the bear was gone. It had probably gone back to sleep. Looking around the outside of the cabin, I saw what it had done last night. My trash can was stomped into the ground, completely flattened. At this point I was more annoyed than anything. A bear wandering around was one thing, but this bear was destroying my property and showing clear signs of aggression. It had to be dealt with soon. I hopped into my truck and drove down the snow-covered road to town to alert the forest rangers about my nightly visitor. Clearly, they did not believe me about the sheer size of this furry giant. They gave me the usual advice about bear spray and securing my trash, but it was too late for that. If the rangers weren't going to help, I had to defend my cabin myself. I stopped at the hardware store on my way back to buy a new, thicker plastic trash can. I also bought a few bear traps and some 12-gauge slug shells for my grandpa's old shotgun. It started snowing again on my way back to the cabin. I had plenty of time to set the bear traps before the sun went down. It snowed all day, and by 6 o'clock p.m. about 2 feet had piled up, covering the traps I had set. Good, I thought. Maybe the bear would step on a trap if it couldn't see it. The night had been quiet for a while. I thought I was in the clear after seeing no more signs of the bear. Just as I started to settle into bed, a soft thud came from the rooftop, as if something had landed on it. Then another thud, and another. It sounded like something was pelting my roof with small stones. Terrified, I grabbed my shotgun and sat up, listening to the strange noises above. Each thud sent a chill down my spine, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to be ready for whatever was coming next. It couldn't be the bear, I thought. Bears can't throw rocks, can they? Irritated by the noise, I got out of bed and looked through the front window toward the trees. No. Why? It's back. That bear came back again, sitting where it did the night before, just staring at me. After locking eyes with it again, I realized this bear had a personal grudge against me. It was probably mad that I woke it from its nap the other day. Whatever, it couldn't do anything as long as I stayed inside. After a few moments of staring, the bear shifted slightly. Then, out of the darkness, the deer skull came flying across the driveway, thrown from the bear's direction into the porch light's glow, landing right where I had placed the first trap. The trap snapped closed around the skull, breaking off both antlers and cracking it in half, scattering bits of bone across the snow. With this single action, the bear showed why it was there. It wasn't mad that I woke it up. It was mad that I, an ignorant human, had trespassed on its land and stolen what was rightfully its. It was clear this bear wasn't letting this go without settling the score. I didn't want to stick around anymore and decided to end my vacation early, but the only road out was snowed in, and my clunky two-wheel drive Ford wasn't getting through that anytime soon. Fearful that my thin pine wood door wouldn't match that massive bear outside, I loaded my shotgun and aimed it out the slightly open window, firing a single warning shot to scare it off. Nothing, not even a flinch. My body tensed from the stress. I raised the gun again and fired another shot right at it. A deep, wailing moan of pain echoed through the air as the bear stumbled back. A moment of silence passed before I saw its eyes appear again, this time shaking with pure blind rage. I stood petrified with terror, my brain melting in fear as I stared ahead and saw those glowing yellow eyes slowly rise up, now standing over 12 feet off the ground, shooting a look of murderous intent down at me through the darkness. Impossible. I stopped believing that what I was looking at was an animal. Whatever it was, it sure wasn't a bear. That monster outside seemed to avoid stepping into the light. It did its best to remain mostly unseen, but its silhouette was easy to make out. By its side, I saw it slowly raise its left arm, place it on the back of the tree next to it, and start pushing. Sounds of cracking wood vibrated through the air as the tree began to lean. Then crack! The tree snapped at the base and fell on top of the cab of my truck, shards of glass exploding outward as the roof crumpled like a tin can under the heavy pine. I stood and watched in fear as that monster looked back up and bared its teeth, yellow, chipped, and gapped, grinning with satisfaction over what it had done. I figured this thing would leave again before the sun came up. I just needed to keep it out till then. That second shot I fired seemed to have had an effect. Perhaps hitting it a few more times would make it back off. I stepped back from the window to reload, briefly losing sight of the monster. Looking back, it was completely out of view. Suddenly, a loud crashing sound came from out back as all the lights shut off. I quickly dove toward the kerosene lantern on the table, struggling to light it as the monster made its way to the front door and started testing the lock. Finally, after lighting it, I reset the globe on the lantern and held it up to the door right as it was smashed in. Chunks of wood were blown back into the cabin, and that creature rushed back behind the trees, avoiding the light again. I looked out the back window and saw what had caused the power to fail. A large moss-covered boulder had been smashed down onto the generator, leaving it in pieces. I wasn't sure what worried me more, the fact that the animal outside was strong enough to lift a rock that size, or the thought that this thing was smart enough to know the generator powered the lights. Some time passed, cold air blasting through the open doorway. I huddled in the corner, staring at the front porch, expecting this thing to come charging inside any minute and stomp my head in. A few hours passed. Dawn would break soon. I sat by the lantern that dimly illuminated the room, wondering if its low light was enough. Suddenly, a massive log was hurled through the window, smashing into the lantern on the floor, soaking the carpet with fuel and setting it ablaze. The fire, my last source of light to keep the monster out. I was in no hurry to put it out. I stood in the open doorway with the warm glow of flames growing larger inside as the cabin floor disappeared in a blaze of orange and red. The sunlight finally broke over the trees, and the creature was nowhere in sight. I leapt off the porch as the cabin was engulfed in flames, the roof caving in as the walls crumbled into ash. I was left defenseless, without shelter or transportation. I wasn't safe there. I had to leave before nightfall. That thing wasn't done with me yet, and without light, there was nothing I could do to stop it. I started to trudge down the driveway through the thick snow, knowing I had to walk the 7 miles to the nearest town before the sun set again. After a few steps into the snow, I realized this was going to be more difficult than I first thought. One more step ahead, and a sharp, searing pain shot up my right leg as something tightly clamped onto my ankle, with jagged spikes digging into my flesh and bone. I had just stepped onto the other bear trap. I fell onto my back in the snow, grasping my leg and crying in pain as I tried to pry the jaws open. It shifted a bit, then clamped tighter, completely severing my foot from my body. I rolled back, vibrating from shock, wallowing in a pool of blood and ice. I passed out for a moment. After the pain subsided a bit, I sat back up, looking down at my leg. The bleeding had slowed as the skin around the wound turned blue from frostbite. Feeling lightheaded, a surge of adrenaline pumped through me. Not ready to give up, I pulled off my belt and tied it around the stump on my leg. Crawling on my hands and knees to the side of the road, I grabbed a stick to use for balance as I continued to shuffle my way down the road, trying to get as far as possible. I didn't make it very far before the sun started setting again. A few more miles to go, and I wasn't going to make it. I fell to my knees, looking up toward the heavens, pleading for assistance, anything to get me out of there. The sky started to darken. I looked back up the road from where I came, the puddle of blood and ice still visible in the distance. As the sun set behind me, the shadow of my body began to stretch slowly, covering up my bloody tracks in the snow as my world was once again cast into darkness. I knew it was there, watching, waiting. It wasn't long before its burning yellow eyes met my gaze as it stepped out onto the road a few feet in front of me. This was it. It had a clear shot straight to me. I looked on with a feeling of defeat, waiting for it to end my suffering, but it just stood there, with its eyes locked on me and its chest puffing in and out as it took short breaths. With a wide stance and its long arms pulsing and ticking, it remained fixated on me. Locked in a stare-down with a deadly, vengeful creature, yet it did not advance. It was waiting for me to make a move. Looking off the road, I saw a potential chance for safety. Building up my nerve, I went for it. The monster started charging at me as soon as I moved. I dived off the side of the road into the ditch and slid myself into the tight stone culvert next to me, feeling a swift gust of air on my legs as the creature took a swipe at me. I wiggled my way in deeper as a giant hairy hand reached in, its long cryptic fingernails scraping the bottom of my shoe. I could feel the ground shaking as it stomped around the outside of the pipe, trying to dig out around it, chipping and smashing away the cement with rocks. I knew it was just a matter of time before it would dig far enough to reach me. My hope started to dwindle for the last time, my head getting dizzy from blood loss. I lay back, waiting for death to take me. Then it stopped. The monster was gone. I lifted my head, looking past my foot and out the pipe. The ground was flooded with a beautiful ray of golden light. I quickly slid out the other end of the pipe, crawled out of the ditch and back onto the road. I was blinded as I basked in the bright, gleaming light of my salvation, a snowplow approaching from down the road, followed closely by the lights and sirens of a fire truck. In a fit of hysterical laughter, I slumped forward, passing out from exhaustion on the cold ground. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed. My leg had died from frostbite and had been amputated. The emergency response team that found me had me airlifted to a hospital in Tacoma. After resting for a while, a duo of police officers entered my room looking to get a statement. They inspected the damage to my cabin and concluded that the fire was caused by a fallen tree. I wondered if they meant the tree that had destroyed my truck. They claimed that the charred trunk of a pine tree was found laid across the foundation of the cabin. That was all that remained among the ashes of what used to be my grandfather's beloved mountain home. That thing had managed to cover its tracks, and covered them well. As for my statement, I couldn't have told them about a 12-foot-tall monster that lurks in the dark. Who would ever believe that? I took a short pause to think, and recounted my frequent visitor, the bear. That sort of explained my little bear trap incident. The officers finished their report and left me to rest. For those who hear my story, I implore you, the next time you enter the backcountry of our western wilderness, it's best not to overstay your welcome. Wearing down the land with excessive foot traffic, invading the homes of wild animals, and disturbing the natural order of nature around you. And if you're still keen on camping, at least don't go alone. There is indeed safety in numbers, for what watches from beyond the shadows may not want you there, and may just show its disdain for your presence. When the sun sets upon the forest, when the woods around you fill with a deathly chill air at night, there, in the absent warmth of light, comes the dark. Story 3. I had been with my girlfriend Jordan for 6 months when I started to suspect that she was pregnant. From the very beginning of our relationship, Jordan had been very clear that she did not want to have children. She put all her love and care into her many exotic pets, which took up most of her free time and money. Even though she spent a lot of time taking care of her pets, she also had a job that kept her away from home often, and she never wanted to leave this job. When I began to notice signs that made me think Jordan was pregnant, she always denied it. At night, she would tremble and feel sick. But when I asked her about it, she would say, "It's nothing. It comes and goes. I'm used to it." This frustrated me because I could see that she was not well, yet she always brushed it off as some vague illness, or because she was tired from exercising too much. I was worried that Jordan was in denial about her condition, even as her symptoms became more obvious. Jordan was tall and muscular, with a stomach so flat and hard that I could imagine her having a pregnancy that didn't show until the very end. As the months went by, her symptoms continued, and I became more convinced she was pregnant. Every time I suggested seeing a doctor, she would get very angry, which made me think she knew exactly what was wrong, but didn't want to tell me. I began to wonder why Jordan was hiding this from me. I thought maybe the baby was sick or was going to die, or perhaps it wasn't mine. This could also explain why she often went away for what she called work trips, but I could never confirm if she was really working. Jordan never told me what kind of job she had, and she was secretive about many parts of her life. I didn't know anything about her family, where she was born, her friends, or even what kinds of animals she kept. She never let me into the room where she kept her pets, and never explained why. My frustration grew because I couldn't understand why Jordan was so secretive, especially about her illness. It got to the point where I couldn't think about anything else. From the start, I found Jordan's mysterious nature attractive. She was like a queen in a fairy tale, with dark, serious eyes that only softened when she felt passionate. I knew she had loved another man before me, but she had left him for some reason she never explained. She moved often, staying in one place for a year or so before moving on. I had never questioned her before because I was captivated by her love, which came without the usual demands and expectations. But now, seeing her behavior as deceitful, I felt disgusted by how easily I had been fooled. When Jordan said she had to go away again for work, I tried everything to convince her to stay and get better. She smelled of sweat and had unwashed hair, and I could hear her struggling to breathe because she felt so sick. I couldn't understand how she thought she could work in such a condition. Her denial scared me so much that I blocked the doorway of my apartment, refusing to let her leave until she agreed to get help. Jordan's face briefly twisted with anger before she quickly controlled it, like a quick flash in a movie. Almost without thinking, I stepped aside, letting her leave. "When are you coming back?" I asked, feeling weak. But she didn't answer and walked away, her strong shoulders slightly hunched from her sickness. Seeing her walk away made me feel a sudden fear, not for Jordan, but for myself. I didn't know where this fear came from, but it had been growing inside me for some time. The next day, after Jordan left early in the morning without saying goodbye, I couldn't concentrate at work. I felt restless and couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Jordan. It had nothing to do with the baby I was sure she was carrying. That evening, I walked home from the office and passed by Jordan's house out of habit. The weather was terrible, with rain hitting me sideways and making my mouth taste like iron and asphalt from the road. The moon shone weakly through the clouds, like the eye of an old dog, and its light showed me that Jordan's car was still in her driveway, unmoved since the day before. I felt a surge of anger because Jordan had lied to me, and then a wave of anxiety hit me again. I ran up to her door and knocked, unsure if she would answer or if I would be left standing in the rain. After a moment, Jordan opened the door, looking at me with a tired, pained expression. "You didn't go to work," I said, stating the obvious. "Too sick." "Yeah," Jordan mumbled, then added, "You shouldn't have come." I was shocked at how quickly she had deteriorated. Her long black hair was stuck to her back with sweat, and she wore an old nightgown as if she couldn't bear the non-existent heat. She stood by leaning against the doorframe, her arm covered in visible veins. "I'm coming in," I said, and gently pushed past her into the dark house. Almost immediately, Jordan turned and rushed upstairs to the bathroom, moving so quickly that I lost my balance. I followed her, wanting to help and persuade her to see a doctor at last. I found Jordan crouched over the toilet, her nightgown clinging to her sweaty body. She was dry heaving, her body moving in waves as if she were no longer human, but a strange creature from a nightmare, afraid of the changes happening within her. "Jesus," I said faintly, "let me get you some water." Surely now she couldn't deny my suspicions that it was our child that had made her so ill, I thought. Yet the longer she poured, choking over the porcelain gripped between her knotted hands, the greater heights to which my nervous doubts crept up like sun-thrown shadows. "Jordan," I said, reaching out to touch the ridge of her shoulder. "Tell me what to do. Do you need an ambulance?" At this she wrenched her arm from under my grip, and her strength even in illness amazed me, as did the snarling depth of her voice as she answered, "No, go home, Ryan, go home." There was a strange quality to her words, a rolling timbre as though distorted by the effects of some machine. Drawing back my hand from her, I was appalled to see blood on my palm and upon her shoulder where I'd touched it. At the neck of Jordan's nightdress, something odd had affected the skin. It had gathered together, splitting open in a glistening aperture through which I glimpsed a surface that was not muscle. Shouting, I tumbled sideways into the sink, streaking the basin with ropes of dark blood. Jordan's face was hidden in a cave of damp hair. Only when she threw back her head in a yell of agony did I see her face had shifted, both jaws sliding out of her skull like some spontaneous dental malformation. Her eyes, molten with pressure, rolled from the knife cuts of narrowed eye sockets into the basin of water below. I watched in stillness under terror's curse, so close that I felt the humidity of Jordan's wounds upon my face, smelled blood and the reek of dank animal fur, that which I had seen through the slit in her skin. Her teeth dropped like shattered icicles into the toilet, new pikes of bone pushed down through the cavities of her gums in their place. Eyes yellow and blind with pain arose in place of the old, and as Jordan raised one hand to clutch at her face, I saw the knuckles bent in two, nails coiled in vicious crescents of black enamel. Jordan stood shaking and groaning on her hind legs, the rag of her nightdress torn off in the vehemence of her change, and still I could not move, though I knew now why she had kept so many animals and why once a month I was driven away. "Go!" said Jordan again, and the command had many syllables, language forced through the throat of a beast. Whether she would have retained her speech or human faculties much longer after that, I'll never know. Pushing off from the sink, I vaulted out of the room and ran through the house, aware with every step of Jordan staggering after me in chase. Only by the time I'd reached the hallway and gotten open the front door was she on all fours as she clearly yearned to be. My last glimpse of Jordan was of a tortured lunatic abomination, human enough even beneath the hair and the crossed swords of teeth that she appeared as what she was, a woman forced to kneel by the disfiguring strength of her moon-born disease. I spent the remainder of the night in a horror-struck delirium, tossing about so furiously in my bed, that there were times I thought she must have caught me with some light scratch I'd been too drowned by my adrenaline to notice, and that I too would change. As it was, I recovered by morning, having in my fever accepted what I'd seen, even if I had no understanding of it. I remembered that Jordan had driven me out, had saved me from my own stupidity in that curious trespass on her night alone, and knew that I still loved her, though she would have killed or turned me in the end. So I went out to look for her, knocking upon her front door at the height of day when I knew it was safe. I heard her shift about in the house, but for all that I called and pleaded for her to answer, she refused to open the door. Possessing no key to the house, I had no way in except by force, which I knew better than to attempt. I did, however, stand at the window of the menagerie room to squint through a gap in the curtains, drawn despite myself by the question of what had become of the inhabitants. The cage doors stood open, each warped by force into shapes like weird alien skeletons. Across the floor lay a rug of drying blood, the heads of animals and tangled viscera, parts submerged and stamped by the green-black stones of flies like ropes of filthy jewels. As I stared upon that death room, my eyes became accustomed to its dingy light, and identified from the assorted matter that at least one of the creatures housed there had been human. I jumped away from the window as though hauled back by a cord at the base of my spine, and retreated to the other side of the street, aware even as I did so of something shifting behind the windows of my lover's house. What it thought as it watched me waver, heaving into a gutter, I do not know. I only knew that it had loved me alone enough to spare me from the starving curse of moonlight or the cage. Story 4. The estate was about an hour's drive from town, hidden in the woods, almost covered by thick branches and vines. The mansion was huge, but not friendly. It stood tall and dark, like something from a scary book. The front door was slightly open, and a dim light was flickering inside. I hesitated at first, but I really needed the money. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside smelled old and musty, like the house had been closed up for years. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I walked slowly down the hall. Nothing moved. It was completely silent except for the faint sounds of the old house. The entryway had no furniture or warmth. In the center of the room, there was a small table with a piece of paper held down by a heavy brass key. I picked up the paper, feeling the cold metal of the key in my hand. The note was written quickly, in handwriting I didn't recognize, but the words were clear. Rules for caretakers, follow exactly. Lock the front door as soon as you enter. Use the silver key hanging on the hook by the door. It's the only key that works. If the key is missing, leave immediately. Do not look back. Do not enter any room with a lit candle. If you see a candle burning, close the door immediately and lock it. Wait until 3:33 a.m. before opening it again. Every hour, wind the grandfather clock in the parlor. If the clock stops, leave the house and take nothing with you. Ignore any knocking you hear. It doesn't matter if it comes from a door, a window, or the walls. Do not acknowledge it. Avoid the west wing after midnight. If you hear footsteps coming from there, go to the kitchen and wait. Do not investigate. If you see her, don't run. She doesn't like it when you run. The job ends at 6 o'clock a.m. At 5:59, leave through the back door. Do not look behind you. If you feel cold air on your neck, run. The last line made me feel scared, but I tried to ignore it. I thought it was just a weird list of rules for someone's house. Maybe they were just very superstitious, but I couldn't turn back now. I looked around and found the silver key hanging on a hook by the door, just like the note said. It was old and worn, but easy to recognize. I took the key, looked back at the door, and then at the brass key. The brass key didn't seem to have a purpose, so I put it in my pocket. I started doing my tasks as the note instructed. The first rule seemed easy enough. Lock the door as soon as you enter. I felt a bit silly, but I did it, locking the door behind me with the silver key. I moved deeper into the house. The second rule made me feel uneasy. Do not enter any room with a lit candle. It seemed strange, but I kept looking out for any candles. As I passed one room, I saw a soft light through the slightly open door. I moved closer and peeked inside. A small candle was flickering on an old oak table, casting long shadows across the room. I felt a chill. The second rule was clear. I wasn't supposed to be in this room. I slowly stepped back, gently closing the door. I turned the lock quietly and moved on, leaving the candle burning inside. My heart was beating faster, but nothing seemed too strange yet. After all, These were probably just the odd rules of a rich, superstitious person, right? The hours went by without anything strange happening, just a few more flickering candles in random rooms. I followed the rules, locking doors, staying away from candles, and minding my own business as best as I could. Then, at 11 p.m., I reached the grandfather clock in the parlor. It stood tall and ominous against the wall, made of brass and dark wood. Its ticking was loud in the quiet house. I checked the time, 11 o'clock p.m. exactly. It was time to wind the clock. It all started with an online ad I found on a hidden job board. I didn't plan to apply, but it caught my eye. Overnight caretaker needed. $500 for one night. Easy tasks. No experience needed. I was in desperate need of money, so I applied without thinking too much. 2 hours later, I got an email with just a time and an address. Avery Estate, 9 p.m. Instructions will be given when I arrive. I opened the glass case around the clock and grabbed the small winding key. As I turned it, the clock made a groaning sound, the gears moving reluctantly. When I was done, I checked the time again. It had barely moved. Strange. I thought I should check it again at midnight. By 12:15 a.m., I was starting to feel like I was wasting time. No one had shown up, and the house was as quiet as a grave. The silence was so intense, and I was becoming more aware of how often I was checking the time. Something about the quiet was making me nervous. Then it happened. Knock, knock, knock. It was soft at first, the sound coming from behind one of the walls. I froze, my mind racing. The fourth rule flashed in my head. Ignore any knocking you hear. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the house settling. I stepped forward, my footsteps slow and careful, trying to push the unease out of my mind. But then the knocking got louder. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the wall behind me. Too clear, too intentional. I should have followed the rule and ignored it, but it was too much. I turned around. Nothing. I swallowed hard. It was nothing. Just the house, the old pipes, the wind. I turned back around, ready to leave, but then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. I covered my ears, fighting the urge to look in the direction it had come from. I wasn't supposed to acknowledge it. The rules said not to, but it felt like the walls were closing in. I moved on, finally making my way to the kitchen. I needed to breathe, but as I entered the room, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my breath shallow. I stood there staring at the door for what felt like forever, the rules echoing in my head. I checked the time, 3:33 a.m. I could have sworn it was just midnight. I'd broken the knocking rule, but the next one hit me hard. Avoid the West Wing after midnight. I had passed the West Wing earlier, but now that I was closer to it, I could hear faint footsteps coming from behind the door. Panic surged through me. My heart pounded against my chest. Then I heard a scratching noise from the direction of the West Wing. It was faint, almost impossible to hear at first. I froze, holding my breath. The footsteps from earlier hadn't stopped. They had just grown fainter, but now they were joined by this strange, unsettling sound, like something or someone was dragging itself across the floor. I tried to follow the rule, avoid the West Wing after midnight. I didn't investigate, but the scratching, it felt like it was calling me. Something deep inside told me to go check, but I pushed it aside, refusing to break the rules. Still, the sound stayed in my mind, gnawing at me like a rat in the walls. By 4:30 a.m., I was pacing the hallway, jumping at every little sound. The house was creaking, groaning, the windows rattling with each gust of wind. I checked every door, every room. I even peeked inside a few with the faint glow of candles, but the moment I saw that light, I turned away and locked the doors behind me as the rules said. But the house seemed heavier now. Every step I took felt like a weight. Then at 5 o'clock a.m., the door to the West Wing creaked open. I hadn't touched it. It had just opened, and for a moment, I thought I saw the shadow of a woman flicker inside. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The air grew colder, sharper. I felt a presence, an invisible force that seemed to be coming closer. The scratching, now louder, echoed from within. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to break the rules and run. But I couldn't. I wasn't done yet. The clock was ticking down, and I was still following the rules. It was 5:45 a.m. now. I moved back into the parlor to check the clock one more time, the ticking now louder than ever. The time read 5:45. I only had 15 minutes, but the house felt like it was closing in on me. My heart raced, my mind frantic. I thought I saw something move in the shadows, But when I looked closer, nothing was there. Then I heard it, a voice. It came from the west wing, a faint whisper, soft but clear. "Run!" I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, cold sweat trickling down my spine. I had to go. The rules said not to look back. The terror was overwhelming. I was seconds away from breaking. The clock struck 5:59 a.m. Without thinking, I ran. My feet hit the floor hard as I bolted down the hallway. The cold air from the back door hit me as I flung it open, stumbling into the night. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning as I sprinted. The gravel crunched underfoot, the trees around me bending and twisting in the wind. I didn't dare look back, but I felt a presence behind me, chasing me. The house seemed to breathe with me, its windows dark and empty. The door I had locked now standing wide open. I threw my car door open and pressed the pedal to the floor. I didn't stop driving until the distant glow of the city lights was visible on the horizon. Only then did I dare to slow down. My legs trembled, my body exhausted, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And I didn't look back. I sat in my car, still shaking, the events of the night playing in my mind. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, another rule I'd follow long after leaving the house, but curiosity got the better of me. The notification was an email. The email subject line said, "Payment confirmation." My heart skipped a beat. I opened it. "Thank you for completing your shift at the Avery estate. $500 has been deposited into your account." That was it. No explanation, just a straightforward message. I refreshed my banking app and there it was, the money. But something felt wrong. The email came from an address I didn't recognize, something like caretaker@jobsportal.com. The sender didn't link to a company. It felt strange, almost like it didn't want to be found. For a moment, I thought about replying, demanding answers, but as my fingers hovered over the keyboard, I remembered the house, the knocking, the whispers. No. Whatever had just happened, I didn't want to know more. The money was in my account, and I wasn't going to ask questions that might pull me back into the nightmare I had just escaped. I closed the email and deleted it from my inbox, along with any trace of that job. But even as I sat there, trying to convince myself it was over, one thought kept bothering me. Who or what paid me, and did I really want to know?